welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a genuinely fascinating yet incredibly tragic chapter of history. How America's incredibly rapid westward expansion actually fueled its most destructive internal conflict. Normally we think of a nation growing as this huge unifying triumph, right? But as you'll see today, adding all this vast new territory to the map essentially forced the United States to confront its deepest, darkest divides.
So here's the big question. How exactly did America's greatest period of physical growth practically guarantee the country would tear itself apart? It's kind of the ultimate paradox in American history. To really get this, we have to look at how gaining all these massive new territories acted as the ultimate, unavoidable catalyst for war. Basically, every time they drew a new border, the nation was forced to answer a question it had been desperately trying to ignore.
And the ideological spark behind all this? Manifest destiny. Now, this wasn't just some dry political policy. It was a fiercely held belief that the United States was quite literally willed by God to spread westward, to control the continent, and to make it fundamentally American. And driven by that intense belief, man, things moved fast. Between 1845 and 1848, the U.S. annexed Texas, provoked and won a war with Mexico, and settled its northern borders with Britain. In just 4 short years, the map of the United States absolutely exploded in size. But here's the catch. All this brand new land exposed a really deep, totally incompatible divide within the country. On one hand, you had a rapidly urbanizing, industrialized North that had largely outlawed slavery, partly driven by European immigrants who came from nations where it was already banned. But on the flip side, you had a deeply rural agricultural South where slavery was viewed as an absolute economic necessity and defended by its proponents as just the natural order of things.
Now, believe it or not, the fulcrum of all this tension really boils down to one single number: 2. Why? Because every single state, no matter how big or small its population was, got exactly 2 U.S. senators. And at this point in time, the Senate was perfectly balanced between states that allowed slavery and states that banned it. So every single new Western territory carved out of that Manifest Destiny expansion became a fierce, high-stakes battleground. You had politicians like David Wilmot pushing to ban slavery in these new lands, while folks like Jefferson Davis demanded it be allowed. The absolute balance of national power was literally hanging by a thread.
So as you can imagine, this aggressive expansion triggered a massive domino effect of political flashpoints throughout the 1850s. The clock was ticking, and loudly. The country tried, and basically entirely failed, to compromise on the expansion of slavery. Just look at the Compromise of 1850. Sure, it brought California in as a free state, but it also came with a highly controversial fugitive slave law. This law legally forced Northerners to hand back escaped slaves, meaning the North had to actively participate in a system they found completely morally abhorrent.
Well, those flawed policies led directly to deadly clashes on the ground. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 basically said, hey, let's just let local settlers vote on slavery, an idea known as popular sovereignty. But that immediately sparked horrific violence, which became known as Bleeding Kansas. Pro- and anti-slavery factions literally flooded into the state and just started killing each other. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court's Dred Scott ruling threw gasoline right on the fire. They declared that black people were not intended to be U.S. citizens at all and had no rights worth protecting. The polarization was absolute. By the time abolitionist John Brown raided Harper's Ferry in 1859 to try and start a slave revolt, the two halves of the country were essentially living in a state of mutual hatred.
Which brings us to the final domino falling in 1860. The brand new anti-slavery Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln. And because the Democratic vote was split, Lincoln managed to win the presidency. Now, looking back, Lincoln was actually quite moderate at the time. He even pledged not to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. But for the South, the damage was already done. Just the fact that a president leaning toward abolition was taking power sparked this immediate, uncontrollable fear that their entire way of life was going to be dismantled.
So, before Lincoln even had the chance to take the oath of office, South Carolina officially declared it had seceded from the United States. Other southern states quickly followed suit, forming the Confederate States of America under Jefferson Davis. The absolute breaking point arrived in April 1861. The federal government refused a Confederate demand to evacuate its garrison at Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So the Confederates opened fire. They captured the fort and officially ignited the American Civil War.
Now, looking at this impartially, there is a truly fascinating paradox here. Both sides actually weaponized the exact same founding document, the Declaration of Independence, to justify the bloodshed. The Union focused heavily on the phrase, all men are created equal.
They argued that owning another human was fundamentally wrong, and that the institution of slavery was actually holding the entire nation back from modernizing. The Confederacy, however, focused on a completely different part, the right to alter or abolish unjust governments. They argued they were forming a better union because the current one threatened their enshrined rights to property, which, of course, in this tragic context, meant enslaved people.
When you look at the raw data, you'd probably assume this war would be over in a month. On paper, the Union held massive, just overwhelming advantages. They had a population of 22 million, heavily industrialized factories and endless miles of railways and telegraph lines. Meanwhile, the Confederacy only had about 9 million people and a completely agricultural economy. But the Confederacy managed to prolong the conflict through incredibly high morale. After all, it's a lot easier to convince troops to fight when they're defending their immediate homeland. Plus, they had highly competent generals, like Robert E. Lee, who ended up handing the Union some pretty shocking early defeats.
And taking a closer look at the demographics reveals just how severe that Southern disadvantage really was. Yes, the South had a population of 9 million, but check out this breakdown. 3.5 million of those people were enslaved. That means a huge chunk of their overall population was, understandably, highly unlikely to fight for the Confederacy's cause. That left a really small pool of free citizens to fight a protracted war against this absolute industrial juggernaut up north.
But despite the math, the war dragged on and on. The Confederates won early major clashes, like the First Battle of Bull Run, and behind the scenes, there was this intense game of international posturing going on. You see, Britain heavily relied on Southern cotton, and an incident called the Trent Affair, where the Union actually captured Confederate diplomats on their way to Britain, very nearly brought the British into the war against the North. Thankfully, those tensions eventually cooled, but the fighting on the ground ground down into brutal, bloody encounters like the Battle of Antietam in 1862. It ended up being a horrific stalemate, but technically a strategic non-loss for the North.
Which brings us to a massive pivot point in our explainer today. Following Antietam, President Lincoln realizes something really profound. To actually win the war and crush the rebellion, he couldn't just fight to preserve the old borders. He had to strike right at the very economic engine of the South, the institution of slavery itself. So, how exactly does a war to save the Union become a war to end slavery?
By issuing one single, masterful document. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, it is incredibly important to note that this didn't just abolish slavery everywhere instantly. It specifically abolished it in all states that were actively rebelling against the Union. Because they were in a state of revolt, Lincoln was able to do this under his unilateral war powers. And honestly, it was a genius maneuver. Not only did it completely shift the moral framing of the entire war, but it also totally deterred European nations like Britain and France from intervening for the South. Both of those nations had already abolished slavery, so they couldn't exactly swoop in and hypocritically fight to defend it.
So, with the moral framing officially shifted and the Union blockade slowly suffocating the South, the tide definitively turned. In 1863, General Robert E. Lee tried to bring the war to northern soil, but he was decisively defeated at the massive turning point battle of Gettysburg. Then, the very next year, General Sherman captured the crucial southern hub of Atlanta. Finally, cornered, exhausted, and out of options, General Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant and Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. The Confederate experiment was officially over.
The war was won, but the cost was absolutely staggering. It even culminated in the tragic assassination of President Lincoln by a Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth. Yet, before the year 1865 was out, the passage of the 13th Amendment officially abolished slavery throughout the entire United States. The primary, undeniable cause of all that bloodshed, the horrific institution that had literally defined the nation's expansion from the very start, was finally legally done away with. The guns eventually fell silent, for sure, and the Constitution itself was fundamentally changed to abolish the institution of slavery. But the deep physical, economic, and emotional scars, those remained. The legacy of Manifest Destiny absolutely gave America its modern shape, but it demanded a terrifying price in blood to settle the contradictions of its founding. Which leaves us with a really profound, lingering question as we wrap up this explainer. You can change the laws, but how long does it take to truly heal a broken nation? Think on that for a bit. And hey, thanks for joining me today.